It's really hard for me to talk about history because it seems so unreal at this point. There was a time that it seemed so important, all of that stuff. And now, it's like a vague memory. And I don't look at it anymore as, it's a memory that's occurring now in this present. And that's probably shifting and evolving to a degree so that I'm not even sure if it's, it makes any sense. But I can talk to you about the story. The Rick story is basically made up of a very compulsive, driven person. And I went to medical school. I worked hard, started a medical practice, had a family, and I was always pushing. Always trying to get the practice, to be more successful. I wanted to be the best parent I could be, the best husband I could be. And also, I was involved in athletics a lot, so I was very driven in that way too. I worked out constantly, hours every day even. And it was never really any time for rest because there's always something to do. And I thought I was happy. There were things, obviously, that when things didn't go my way, so-called, I was very unhappy. But for the most part, I thought of myself as a happy person. And then out of the blue, I was diagnosed with cancer about 13 years ago. And that seemed to change everything. I mean, I was involved in spiritual pursuits before, but in the same driven way that I was involved with everything else. It was like another badge for me. Successful doctor or successful athlete. And now I was going to be, an enlightened person. I worked hard at it. I went to Zen temples. I spent hours and hours meditating. Some of these retreats were like 14 hours a day of meditating. And then this diagnosis happened, and it was like just a huge shock. It was a shock to every way in which I had defined myself, because I thought of myself as healthy. And it was part of my job to talk about health and to tell people how to be healthy. So it was not only a shock, but it was an embarrassment. I didn't even want to see anybody. I didn't want anybody to know that I was even sick at all. And then everything that I had sort of worked for, so to speak, every way in which I had defined myself was ripped away. I could no longer work out. I had to have lung surgery. I could no longer work out. I couldn't swim. I had to have a back surgery afterwards. I couldn't bicycle. I couldn't run. And my medical practice, I couldn't practice. I was really basically disabled for months and months and months. That all fell apart. And even, as a father, I just felt, I was so devastated and so depressed. I was sort of pulled into myself that I was actually drifting away from my family, which was always the most important thing to me. And in this kind of despair, there was a sense somehow that if I could get enlightened, that would be something that would change everything, because maybe my cells would become enlightened. Maybe I would cure myself of cancer. I was afraid of death at that point and didn't know what was going to happen. I had no real idea about the future and just felt the future was very bleak. And followed spiritual teachers, went to India. I mean, it was very intensely, like that, everything else I did. I just did it with a lot of intensity and a lot of desperation, really. And then in the depths of despair, I mean, I was at the point really where nothing seemed to be working. I was so miserable and so disgusted with myself for being sick even in the first place that I wasn't even sure I wanted to live. And then I felt guilty about that. I was going to abandon my family, and it was really a mess. And then I heard a friend of mine, someone who subsequently became a friend, Satyam Nadeem, say, consciousness is all there is, and you are that. I had heard that before in many different ways, but somehow never really sank in, never really heard it. And in that moment, there was a realization that who is this Rick character trying to fight with life? Who is he trying to save? And how, in what way can he possibly be separate from consciousness, from everything, from all there is? It was just, that's all it was just evolving, and Rick was just a story in that evolution. And in that moment, Rick didn't just disappear, but in that moment there was a recognition that Rick never existed in the first place. There was never any separate individual. It was just a story. And that story, that's why I said the stories really are not that meaningful. And this whole story of the Rick is really just, like I said, it's just a thought occurring in the present moment. This is, but everything changed and yet nothing changed. There was no longer a fear of death. There was no longer a concern about the future. And there was just, peace. The word that came to mind, I remember very vividly that surrender came to mind. But even that it became clear that there was nobody surrendering to nothing. It was just surrender. And it was this most blissful surrender. Probably the worst phrase I could ever hear before that would have been giving up. That would be anathema to the way I was. And then yet this surrender, which in essence is just that, was complete bliss and utter peace. And that peace really never left. Subsequently, there was this huge sense of gratitude. And I felt that I needed to express it to someone. And so, this sort of event occurred down in Costa Rica at Nadine's hotel. So we went back to New York, and I had to find out where Nadine was, where he lived. I found out that he lived in Georgia, and I basically emailed him. I said I had to come see you. I had to express gratitude to him. And actually, out of that, we just became friends. And we traveled around several different countries the year after that, talking about this. Nadine had been a spiritual teacher for a while, was pretty well known in Europe particularly, but did a lot of satsangs around the US. And for a number of years I went with him to Baden-Baden, which was a spiritual event. And then he stopped going, and I went another couple of years, and so it was once a year. That's my my teaching experience. Once a year I had been going to Baden-Baden and gave a couple of talks, and then more recently there's a group of people in New York who email me every once in a while and ask me to do, to have a meeting, and that happens maybe once every couple of months. It's basically the same character with maybe softened edges. I don't see anything any different. I just sort of, the dominant experience is peace. And it's not felt like it's coming from me. It's felt like that's what is. That's just a reflection of the peace, of the love that is all there is. But I've heard feedback from other supposed characters that, like my wife, who says that I appear more real. I was saying today, in my talk, that it's kind of ironic that I'm nothing and I appear more real. But I guess that's the craziness of life. So I don't think they had the same interests. Things had to change, because of physical changes, but basically the same interests. And I tend to be the same hard-working character, but maybe without the desperation. My wife also said that I still was, always constantly looking for ways to deal with cancer. And that's in my work as well, as a doctor. And I'm very, I guess you can say compulsive about it yet, but it doesn't have the same quality, the same feeling of desperation, I think, that was there before. Yeah, there was definitely no fear of death. That was the question? Yeah. There's no longer fear of death. And I think, it's not even a fear of death as much either as there's no attachment to any outcomes. It's just, it's just now. And now is enough, And it doesn't really, it's not like the outcomes don't matter, it's just they don't enter into it. They're just, just being in this moment is enough. And there's a trust that outcomes take care of itself. Everything is okay. There's a recognition that that time is really illusory. It's just a concept that arises within this all there is, within this piece. And so the idea of a past, of a history, has sort of faded away. It's not that I can't speak about what seems like the past, what people agree on as the so-called past, but it doesn't seem to be important. And the same for the future. There's just this moment, and then there may be thoughts about a so-called something to come, as if it were outside of this moment, which it isn't. There's nothing outside of the present. It's just eternal. So it's funny, I think if anything is probably more intense but shorter lived. There's no concern about getting angry, for example. I mean, anger will come and it'll just blow over, it's just done. It's very interesting. I think, I've noticed this in a lot of questions that come up, there seems to be a constant monitoring, that there's there's an idea that there's a certain state, a certain quality to this or to the so-called people who've seen this, and there's a constant monitoring. Am I there or am I not there? And that doesn't seem to have anything to do with a state of bliss or a state of peace. It's not that. It's just a knowing, and that knowing is not even necessarily something that's consciously thought of. It's just known. When the issues come up, it's just, it's clear. But when the issues don't come up, there's just life. There's just life. And life is lived without any concern about the way one appears or the way one sounds or seems. And so I think emotions, there's no separation from emotions. Emotions come and then they go. That's just not important. Well, I think it's very clear that I have nothing to offer, nothing to give people. There's really no investment in anything changing. It's so clear to me that the world is absolutely perfect the way it is. Now that doesn't stop things from changing. The apparent world, the story that we seem to live in, changes constantly. And there does seem to be motivation in that story and cause and effect and teachers and students. But there's absolutely no investment in any of that going on. It's just going on, and there's an acceptance of all that. So, despite the fact that I have nothing to say, and despite the fact that there's no expectation that anybody's going to benefit from anything that comes out of this, they're still talking. And then there's feedback that, oh yeah, it was really a nice talk, and it was whatever, or you're full of crap, and they run away. But there's no need, there's no worry about it. But what I do seem to try to make clear, that this is not a state. And this is, the very desire to look into the history of the so-called individuals is part of this separation. It's part of the idea that there's something special here. And the truth is, in these talks, there's nothing. There's no wisdom here. The wisdom is the questions and the answers. The answers and the questions, they're all arising from what is. And without the questions, there's no answers. I said today in the talk that, if somebody asked me for a recipe for cake, I would just sit there dumb. Wouldn't know anything. It's this context that where wisdom seems to arise, and it arises simultaneously with the questions and the answers. And it doesn't reside anywhere. It doesn't belong to anyone. Yeah, that's certainly what it seems like. It does seem like sharing. And just like the same personal history seems to really be illusory, there's no history. It seems as if that the questions are evolving too, but the same way, it's really no history. It's just, everything every so-called deepening of understanding it's clear that it was always known. And even, before, so-called before and after the shift, it was a recognition of what's always been known. And every deepening that seemed to occur over time, because there has been, we were talking earlier about, how teachers seem to, look back on what they said a few years ago if they see a video, and it doesn't make any sense to them anymore. That evolution is really occurring in the eternal now. And it's not really occurring at all. It's always been. There's a recognition that the evolution of these questions, as well as the evolution of the answers, is all just a story that's arising now. Well, the paradox is that in the world of appearance, in the so-called story, time is. Time is, it seems very clear that there are individuals, that there's an individual, and there's talking to other individuals, that there's time over which things take place. There's no concern about the apparent paradox, because it does, obviously it's a paradox. How can this nothing, which has no characteristics, it doesn't occur over time, it's all there is, and nothing ever happens. And yet out of this nothing ever happens, out of this nothing, this entire world with billions of years of history and all of these amazing events, the entire universe, forget about the world, the Big Bang, stars colliding, galaxies, dinosaurs, the entire evolution. How does that happen? And it is paradoxical, and yet there's no concern about the paradox. This knowing doesn't require any explanations. There's such a complete embrace of what is that the questions just fall away. There's really no answers, but there are really no questions anymore. I think there's probably less concern about outcomes. Like I said before, that's also paradoxical, because despite the just involvement in the present and the apparent, unconcern about outcomes, everything that needs to be done still gets done. There still seems to be a Rick working his butt off trying to help people, and yet there's a knowing that it's just not all as it appears, When you're in it, there's really no really thoughts. It's just total involvement. That's really embracing life, for what it is. I think there is a concept that somehow this creates someone that steps back. In fact, a more separated individual steps back and just views life as some kind of a witnessing process. And it's the opposite. It's a full and utter engagement by no one with nothing. What could be more fully engaged? There's no individual to separate themselves from any other individual. There's no subject and object. It's just a verb. So there's just engaging. And these ideas don't even ever come up unless the questions come up. Yeah, I don't know anything about traditions. None of that really matters at all to me. I was a pretty intense seeker, in the history and in the history of Rick. Afterwards, there just seemed to be no interest in that. It's not, I still get fascinated in the world of appearance. There are certain things that I really, enjoy learning about and understanding. I seem to be very interested in learning about cancer and about the way it works and about doing things that may help. I'm very involved in the research there. So it's not really different from somebody who's interested in Advaita, interested in Buddhism. It's just another way of, but the quality is different. There's no desperation to the seeking anymore. There's not a desperate need to understand Advaita or Buddhism or cancer. There's activity as if there's a need, but yet it's an okay, it's just what I do. And there's actually an enjoyment of it. There's nothing that gets in the way of enjoyment because there's no goal in mind. There's nothing that has to happen in the future in order to make it right. Hmm? I mean, the knowing is just a word. You can also call it, knowing nothing too. It's just, there's a knowing that that not all as it seems. It's a kind of, there's a knowing that there's no longer a belief in anything outside of this oneness. And there's also a comfort in accepting the mysteriousness of it all, the complete and utter mystery that will never be explained. And there's no desire to explain it. It's enough just being what it is. So there's no need to explain it. So I think I mentioned earlier, there's no answers, but the questions just have, fallen away. No, very rarely. I mean, I read books on medical books, but that's every once in a while I'll hear about a book, or something will catch my eye and resonate, and I'll read something. And like I think I was saying earlier, Jeff Foster is someone I particularly enjoy reading. So when he has a new book coming out, if I hear about it or if I think about it, I definitely will read it, because it's like looking at myself in the mirror. I heard him speak yesterday, the same kind of thing. It was just a feeling like, God, it's such a pleasure, because it really is like seeing another face of yourself, And everything in life is like that. Everything in life is another face of yourself, but yet there are things that really are so much more fun or so much clearer, and that has to do just with, the so-called individual characteristics of the story character. So that's why I say that everything is fine. There are spiritual teachers that resonate much better with other people, and they're not wrong or right. It's just the way it is. So things like that I'll still read, just for pleasure. I'm not trying to get anything. It's just fun. It's a real pleasure. I wouldn't say that I slowed it down as much as the desperation was gone. The actual, the actual doing, the apparent doing, was still there, probably at the same level. I mean, for example, if certain physical things hadn't changed, I probably would be exercising like a demon, because that was something that gave me great pleasure, and still does, And and I still do seem to have at least the intensity in terms of focusing, being able to focus and spending hours and hours doing something. In this case now it's mostly researching cancer. But there's a qualitative difference, I think, rather than the quantitative. But there's no I would say there's no requirements to this shift. Anything can happen. I mean, there are people can, if you want to call them people. Once this happens, some people give up everything. Their whole prior life changes, and they go off on a mountaintop or start doing spiritual teaching that they'd never done before. It wasn't that way with me. Initially, the change was dramatic in that I spent about a year and a half just sitting in a chair for 6-8 hours a day, with absolutely no goal in mind, no purpose. I wasn't meditating per se. I was just sitting. In fact, it was the first time I ever understood what the Zen people were saying when they said just sit, because that's what I was doing. Just time would go by, so-called time would go by, and I would have absolutely no concept of it. My wife would literally have to basically come up and tell me that it's time for dinner, and that went on for about a year and a half. But it wouldn't necessarily have to be that way. I mean, anything can happen. That's the beauty and the mystery of life, how varied it is. And there's no requirements, no conditions. I mean, I don't think it's absolutely required that we have to go through these life-shattering or impact, not what Nadine calls a dark night of the soul. There's certainly a lot of stories about that and about these dramatic shifts in those supposed individuals who, went through this so-called dark night of the soul. But I think those are we like our stories and we like our drama, and those seem to be much more vivid. I think what happens in those stories is that the contrast between the absolute utter misery of the dark night is so great that the so-called awakening has so much contrast that it just bursts forth, and it's so obvious, and there's a pressure to just share that message with the world. So a lot of teachers come out of that, I think, out of that so-called story. And but I've had occasion to meet very young people, teenagers, where this message is completely clear from the start. I mean, it seems like they've known that all their lives and never went through any kind of dark night. And I know there are a couple of stories of teachers even who've done that. So I don't think anything is necessary. I don't think there's any preconditions to this, but I do think that the ones, life definitely seems to be interested in contrasts. And those big contrasts is what we usually hear about, and that's usually what people want to hear about. We love drama. Who am I? I don't know. I have no idea. Honestly, I have absolutely no idea. I know this is a question of inquiry that people follow, and it's supposed to lead toward the understanding that you're no one. I always wondered why, it just never drew me in. That form of self-inquiry never really drew me. It's interesting that it kind of did itself. The one that I thought I was, the one that was, seemed to be Rick, just was completely burned up in the fire of life. It was just totally destroyed by the so-called events in life. So in a way, I was off the hook. I didn't have to do all that self-inquiry. I was just destroyed right off the bat.